In tonight's episode, we have two terrifying stories to share, and one of them takes us straight into the restless heart of Bangkok, where the streets never truly sleep, but some shadows never leave. Behind the chatter of street vendors and the neon glow of the city, there are whispers carried only among those who drive the night shift, whispers of passengers who are not quite alive. Taxi drivers tell it the same way. They say it begins like any ordinary ride. The request comes late at night, usually from two women dressed head to toe in black. Their faces are hidden beneath dark veils, their silence thick and unnatural. They sit in the back seat without a word, giving only a single destination: Wat Samian Nari, a temple pressed against the edge of the city. But the silence inside the car feels wrong, a stillness that seems to push against the sound of the engine, and by the time the driver pulls into the temple's gates, the women are gone, vanished into nothing but an empty back seat, and the stench of rot lingering in the air. So who are these women? Why do they appear only after dark? And why do some drivers swear they saw them crawling across the nearby railway tracks, severed in half, as if death itself still clings to them? Bangkok after midnight is a different city altogether. The streets grow quieter, the vendors pack up their stalls, and only the hum of motorcycles and the occasional flash of neon signs cut through the darkness. It is a time when the city feels less alive, more like a shadow of itself. For many, it is simply the end of the day. But for taxi drivers, it is when the most unsettling fares begin. Our main character is one of them. A driver who has worked the streets of Bangkok long enough to know every shortcut, every late-night stop, every strange request. He is not superstitious, at least not anymore. After years behind the wheel, he has learned to brush off the stories other drivers whisper about the dead riding among the living. Ghosts were for tourists to hear about in markets, not for men who survive off the streets. Yet as the nights pass, he cannot ignore that Wat Samian Nari Temple always seems to linger in conversations. It is never spoken of directly, always hinted at. A warning wrapped in silence. This night, he has only one goal: stay out long enough to earn a few more fares before returning home. The city feels heavier than usual. A pale yellow moon hangs low above the skyline, and the alleys stretch darker than he remembers. He tries not to think about the temple. The place sits along the railway tracks on the northern edge of the city, a landmark many avoid after dark because of what is said to wait there. He tells himself it is nonsense. He is here for money, not stories. But then it happens. He sees them. Two women standing perfectly still by the roadside. Their figures are slim, wrapped entirely in black cloth, their faces hidden beneath dark veils. They do not wave. They do not gesture. They simply stand as though they were already waiting for him. Against his better judgment, he slows down and rolls to a stop. The women step inside without a word. The sound of the door shutting echoes too loudly in the empty street. He glances into the rearview mirror, but all he can make out is the faint outline of fabric and the impression of eyes watching him from beneath the veil. His chest feels heavy, but he clears his throat, asking the routine question, "Where to?" The answer is simple. The words come in a soft whisper, almost too faint to hear. Wat Samian Nari. The name alone unsettles him, but he nods, pretending not to care. He tells himself it is only coincidence. Plenty of people visit the temple. It is not unusual. Yet his hands grip the wheel tighter as he pulls back into the empty road. The city begins to blur as the ride stretches on. The only sound is the soft rattle of the car engine. The women do not speak. They do not move. They simply sit in the back as if carved from shadow. Every glance into the mirror makes him uneasy. He cannot shake the feeling that they are not passengers at all, but something else, something heavier, pressing into the back seat. The streets thin out, the neon signs vanish, and the road grows darker as they near the railway tracks. He tries to focus on driving, reminding himself of his goal. A few more fares, just enough to cover the week. Nothing more, but deep down, he knows this is no ordinary ride. Something about these women, something about the silence, feels too unnatural. The air inside the car is thick, almost suffocating. And as the temple finally comes into view, standing quietly beyond the tracks, he realizes this is not a ride he ever should have taken. The road stretched out before him in a long strip of darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of a streetlight. He drove slower than usual, not because of traffic. There was none at this hour, but because every movement in the mirror seemed to weigh on him. The women in the back seat had not spoken again since whispering their destination. Their silence filled the space more completely than words ever could. The driver cleared his throat, a small habit he had when nerves began to creep in. Normally, conversation made these long rides easier. He would ask passengers about their work, where they were headed, sometimes even offer small jokes. But when he opened his mouth this time, nothing came out. The words died before reaching his lips, smothered by the pressure of their presence. He told himself he was imagining it, but the air in the car felt heavy, as if every breath demanded more effort than the last. Then came the first strange detail, something so small he almost ignored it. The digital clock on his dashboard flickered. One moment it read 1:37 in glowing red numbers, and the next it went completely dark, as though the power had been cut. He tapped the dashboard, annoyed, but the light blinked back on, now showing 1:52. 15 minutes, gone in an instant. He frowned, glancing at the mirror again. The women hadn't moved. He muttered under his breath, trying to steady himself. Maybe the clock was broken. It was an old car after all. Still, he couldn't shake the thought of lost time. The city thinned further as they pushed into the outskirts. Shops shuttered with corrugated steel doors lined the streets, graffiti scrawled across them like scars. Stray dogs darted across alleys, and somewhere in the distance, a train horn cut through the silence. He felt grateful for the sound, grounding him in something real. But then his headlights swept across a reflective road sign, and his chest tightened. Wat Samian Nari, 2 kilometers ahead. He swallowed, suddenly dry in the throat. That temple again. That name that clung to late-night whispers between drivers who swore they would never take fares in this direction. He told himself he could still turn back, still find an excuse. Yet the thought of speaking, of addressing the women behind him, made his skin prickle. He reached for the radio, thinking some music might break the tension. But when he twisted the dial, only static poured through the speakers. He turned it down quickly, the sound too sharp in the oppressive quiet. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, like old water left to stagnate in a drain. He wrinkled his nose, rolling his shoulder as if he could shrug the odor away. But the longer he drove, the stronger it became. A thick, cloying stench that reminded him of raw meat left too long in the sun. He glanced at the mirror, his stomach tightening. The women still sat perfectly still, but now he could swear the air behind them looked darker. Almost as if a shadow clung to their seats, refusing to be touched by the glow of the street lamps. He coughed, lowering the window a crack. The rush of humid night air did nothing to mask the smell. If anything, it seemed to spread faster. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. Questions pressed against his mind, desperate to escape. Who were these women? Why had they chosen his car? And why did the stench of decay seem to follow them like a second skin? He forced his gaze forward, pretending not to notice. But the illusion of control shattered when the engine stuttered. The car jolted once, twice, and then the headlights flickered, plunging the road into sudden darkness. His heart slammed against his ribs as he twisted the key, praying it would hold. The lights sputtered back on, weak and trembling, before steadying again. He let out a shaky breath, but his relief was short-lived. Because in that brief moment of darkness, he could have sworn the back seat was empty. The mirror now showed them again, sitting silently as though they had never moved, but his skin crawled with the memory. The car smelled worse, the rot pushing into his nostrils until his stomach churned. He wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but his tongue felt heavy, as if something in the air pressed it down. He pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to reach the temple and rid himself of this ride. Yet deep down, he already knew something had shifted. This was no ordinary fare. This was the first sign that whatever had stepped into his car was not meant to leave it the same way passengers normally did. And still, the women sat in silence, watching, waiting. The further he drove, the more the city seemed to dissolve around him. The buildings grew sparse, the lights dimmer, until it felt as though he had left Bangkok altogether and entered some in-between place that didn't belong to the living. The smell was unbearable now, so thick it clung to the back of his throat. He forced shallow breaths, one hand gripping the wheel, the other brushing sweat from his brow. The women in the back remained motionless. He dared another glance at the mirror, and his stomach tightened. They were closer. He could swear they were sitting forward now, their veils hanging inches from the back of his seat, though he hadn't heard them move. He blinked hard, refocused on the road, and almost missed the shape up ahead. A man was standing in the middle of the street, waving his arms wildly. The driver slammed the brakes, tires screeching as the car lurched to a stop. The figure rushed to his window, a panicked local with deep lines etched into his face. His voice came rapid, strained, in Thai. The driver rolled the glass down halfway, catching only fragments. But the meaning was clear enough. Don't take them there. Don't go to the temple. The man's eyes flicked toward the back seat, and his face went pale. Without another word, he staggered backward, almost tripping over himself as he disappeared into the shadows at the roadside. The driver called out, demanding an explanation, but the man was gone. He shut the window quickly, his pulse hammering in his ears. When he dared look back at his passengers, they hadn't moved at all. Still seated, still veiled, still watching. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to abandon the ride. But the thought of addressing them, of refusing, was worse than continuing. So he drove on, though his hands trembled against the steering wheel. The engine growled low, fighting him. Twice more it coughed, the lights dimming, and each time he begged under his breath for it to hold. The temple loomed closer now, its spires rising faintly against the night sky. Yet as they neared, the car grew heavier, as though some invisible weight pressed it down. He pressed the pedal harder, but the speedometer refused to climb. Then came the second event. From behind him came a sound, soft but unmistakable, a wet, dragging noise, like fabric soaked through with water being pulled across the seat. He froze. His eyes darted to the mirror, but it was useless. The veils obscured everything. All he could see was the faint sway of their heads. He thought he saw one tilt unnaturally, bending too far to the side. He gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel tighter, forcing himself to look forward again. But then the noise changed. The soft drag became a sharp scratching sound, nails against upholstery. The car shuddered, and for a moment he thought the back seat was splitting open beneath their weight. Almost there, he whispered to himself, though his voice cracked. Almost there. The train horn sounded again in the distance. Relief flickered for a moment. Something normal. Something real. But then, over the sound of the horn, he heard another noise. Laughter. Not loud, not even clear, but a faint, breathless giggle that made his blood run cold. It was the first time either of them had made a sound. The driver's hands shook. He slammed the radio dial again, desperate for distraction. But this time, static wasn't what came through. A woman's voice spilled from the speakers, whispering in broken Thai. He caught fragments, his name, the word accident, and then a sharp burst of static that made him yank the dial back off. The silence afterward was worse. Up ahead, the crossing gates were lowering. Red lights flashed in the darkness, warning of the oncoming train. He slowed the car reluctantly, heart pounding. The women shifted for the first time, both of them leaning forward together, veils brushing against the back of his seat. He could hear them breathing now, shallow, raspy inhales that carried the smell of decay stronger than ever. The train roared past, its massive weight shaking the ground. And in that chaos, he saw them. On the tracks, illuminated by the train's headlamps, two figures crawled, women in black dragging themselves forward with their arms, their bodies cut cleanly in half at the waist. Their entrails dragged against the rails, smearing dark stains across the steel. Their heads tilted toward him, mouths open in silent screams. He blinked, and they were gone. The women in his back seat had not moved, but his knuckles were white around the wheel, and his body screamed for him to run, to abandon the car, to flee into the night. He couldn't. Not yet. The gates lifted, the road was open again, and the temple waited at the end of it. But now he knew the truth. Whatever sat in his back seat wasn't simply going there, it belonged there, and he was the one delivering them home. The temple gates rose in the distance, their shadowed spires cutting across the moonlight. The driver's chest tightened as he approached, every muscle in his body urging him to turn the wheel and flee. But the women in black leaned forward again, their presence pressing against him like an invisible weight. The smell of rot now clung to the air so thickly that it burned his nostrils. He wanted to gag, but he held it down, eyes locked on the road. As the car rolled closer to the temple, the engine sputtered once more, coughing and jerking as though the machine itself resisted. He muttered a prayer under his breath, though he wasn't the type to pray. The headlights flickered, plunging the street into darkness, before returning with a sickly yellow glow that barely cut through the night. Then the women moved. It wasn't subtle. He heard the shift, the fabric of their veils rustling, as one of them leaned so far forward that he could see the outline of her chin beneath the cloth. It was grey, discolored, like spoiled meat. He jerked his gaze back to the windshield, hands slick with sweat against the wheel. "Almost there," he whispered, but his voice trembled. The car passed the railway tracks, and that was when everything changed. The engine died. The car lurched to a complete stop right across the crossing, red warning lights beginning to flash again. He panicked, twisting the key, pumping the pedal. Nothing. The headlights cut out completely, and the world dropped into total darkness, save for the rhythmic glow of the signal lights reflecting off the rails. In the mirror, the women sat in silence. He could feel their eyes on him, even though their faces were hidden. Then came the sound. A wet dragging, louder this time, echoing from behind him. He spun around, and his breath caught. The back seat was empty. His pulse thundered in his ears as he whipped his head side to side. Empty. Nothing but dark fabric pressed into the cushions. But the smell, the overwhelming stench, had grown worse, coating his tongue, making his stomach twist. He clutched the wheel tighter, refusing to believe what he had just seen. Then movement. From outside the car, just beyond the windshield, two shapes crawled across the track. He blinked hard, but the sight did not vanish this time. Two women, dressed in black, their torsos dragging against the gravel. Below their waists, there was nothing. Their entrails stretched behind them, smeared into the dirt as they pulled themselves forward with clawing, desperate hands. Their faces, half obscured by veils, turned toward him in unison, and for the first time he saw their eyes. White, lifeless, yet locked directly onto him. The driver's hands shook violently. He tried the ignition again, twisting, begging. The car roared once, sputtered, then went silent. He slammed the steering wheel in frustration, his breath ragged. The signal bells clanged, growing faster, louder. A train was coming. He looked back at the crawling figures. They were closer now, dragging themselves directly toward his stalled car. The sound of their hands scraping against the gravel was unbearable, like nails on glass. And then came the laughter. From inside the car, he spun around, his throat tightening. The back seat was no longer empty. The two women were there again, seated perfectly still, their veils hanging low. But beneath the fabric, their shoulders shook with a sick, breathless giggle that didn't belong in any living throat. The sound filled the cab, rising in pitch until it no longer sounded like laughter at all, but like something breaking, splintering. "What do you want?" the driver gasped, his voice trembling. His hands were white, knuckled around the wheel, though he no longer believed the car could save him. The laughter stopped. For the first time, one of the women spoke clearly. Her voice was a whisper and a rasp at once, as though carried from the bottom of the grave. "Home." The word crawled through him, chilling his bones. His breath caught as the figures outside reached the side of the car. Their grey hands slapped against the doors, smearing dark stains across the windows as they clawed their way upward. He could see their faces now, only inches from the glass, skin torn, flesh sunken, jaws slack. The driver squeezed his eyes shut and twisted the key one last time. The car roared, alive again, and the headlights blazed, casting the railway tracks into blinding white. He floored the accelerator, the tires screeching against the gravel, propelling the car forward, just as the train thundered past behind him. The force of it shook the ground, rattling his bones, but he kept his eyes locked forward, refusing to look back. When he finally dared to breathe, he glanced at the mirror. The women were gone. His chest heaved, relief mixing with confusion. The smell was gone too, replaced by the acrid scent of burning rubber from the tires. He slowed the car, shaking his head in disbelief. Had he imagined it all? But the road stretched ahead, and the temple loomed larger now than ever before. He had not passed it. He was still going toward it. And though the seats behind him looked empty, the faintest sound lingered in the silence. The rustle of fabric, a whisper, and then, softly, two voices together. "You brought us home." The temple gates loomed larger with every passing second, their black silhouettes rising like jagged teeth against the pale glow of the moon. The driver's hands trembled as he clutched the steering wheel, his body running on instinct alone. He had no idea how the car was still moving, how the engine had come back to life after stalling on the tracks. All he knew was that he was still being driven forward, as if something unseen had seized control of the machine and was guiding it to the place it was always meant to arrive. The smell had returned, not as suffocating as before, but sharp enough to remind him of every moment he had tried to convince himself it was his imagination. The stench of rot, of damp earth, of something pulled from a grave too soon. He refused to look in the mirror. He knew what would be waiting for him there. At last, the car rolled to a stop just outside the temple gates. He had not pressed the brake, yet the vehicle shuddered into stillness, as though commanded by something far stronger than him. The women sat in silence in the back seat, veils still lowered, bodies unnaturally still. For the first time since picking them up, the driver felt compelled to turn and face them directly. His body resisted, every nerve screaming for him not to, but his head turned anyway, slow and jerking, as if someone else had taken hold of his muscles. What he saw shifted everything he thought he knew about the ride. Their veils no longer hid them. In the dim light, their faces were visible, half-rotted, twisted, pale flesh, stretched tight against bone. Their eyes were hollow but glowed faintly in the dark, unblinking. And then he noticed something worse. Their bodies were not whole. Beneath the folds of black cloth, their torsos ended abruptly at the waist, the fabric tapering off into nothing. They were exactly as the stories said, women cut in half, as if frozen in the moment of their death. The driver's stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to scream, but his voice failed him. The silence inside the cab stretched so long it felt unbearable, and then one of the women spoke again. "You brought us home." Her whisper cut through him like glass. He shook his head violently. "No," he rasped. "No, you." Before he could finish, the temple bells rang. The sound was soft at first, then louder, echoing across the grounds. With each toll, he felt a weight pressing harder into his chest. The women began to fade, their veiled figures flickering like smoke in the corner of his vision. But they did not disappear quietly. "Do you know why?" the second woman whispered. Her voice was lower, colder, dripping with resentment. The driver shook his head again, his hands gripping the wheel as though it were the only real thing left in the world. "We died here," she said. The words struck him harder than he expected. He had heard the rumors, of course, every driver had. A motorcycle accident in the 90s. 2 women, friends or sisters, no one was quite sure, crushed on the railway tracks near Wat Samian Nari. Some claimed their bodies were split in half by the train. Others said they had been dragged across the gravel until nothing remained whole. Everyone who spoke of it did so in hushed voices, quickly changing the subject, as though even mentioning the story too loudly might summon them. Now, he knew the whispers had not been just stories. They were warnings. The driver sat frozen as the bells tolled again. The women's faces began to blur, their outlines losing form as though dissolving into the air. He wanted to believe they were leaving, that the nightmare was ending. But their voices lingered even as their bodies faded. "They never buried us," one of them whispered. "They left us here," the other hissed, the sound carrying a bitterness that chilled him to the bone. The driver's heart pounded. The stories had never said this. They had never mentioned anything about burials or bodies left behind. He wanted to deny it, but the weight of their voices pressed against him until denial felt impossible. He realized, with dawning horror, that the temple wasn't just their destination, it was their prison. The bells rang once more, and with that final toll, the women vanished completely. The back seat was empty, the smell evaporated, the car was silent. The driver sat in the dark, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving. He stared at the gates of the temple, wondering if he had imagined it all. But deep down, he knew better. The details were too sharp, the voices too real, and the whispers of other drivers suddenly made sense. It wasn't just that the women appeared near the temple. It wasn't that they wanted rides in the dead of night. They wanted witnesses, someone to carry their presence, even if only for a short while. Someone to remind the living that their deaths had never been put to rest. The driver turned the key again, and to his shock, the car purred to life on the first try. The dashboard lights glowed a steady red. No flickers, no stutters. He stared at the road ahead, torn between fleeing and stepping out to the gates. He almost opened the door, some strange pull urging him to see if the women had told the truth, to find evidence. But something in him held back. A warning he couldn't ignore. Instead, he pressed the accelerator, turning the car sharply and speeding back into the city. He didn't look into the rearview mirror. He didn't dare, and though the night had quieted and the smell had gone, one truth followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. The women in black weren't haunting the roads of Bangkok for no reason. They were trapped. And every driver who picked them up was just another unwilling participant in their endless journey back to the place where their lives had been violently cut in two. He sped through the empty streets, the glow of the temple shrinking in his rearview mirror. His knuckles were white around the steering wheel, his body trembling from what he had seen. Every instinct told him not to look back, not to risk seeing those hollow eyes staring at him again. The city lights slowly reappeared, neon signs flickering back to life, the hum of Bangkok returning. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe it was over. Then he noticed the time. The glowing red numbers on the dashboard read 3:7. He froze. The last time he had checked, before the temple, it had been just after 1:30, nearly 2 hours gone, swallowed by nothing. He hadn't stopped, hadn't slowed. Where had the time gone? His breath quickened as he pulled into a side street to gather himself. He shut off the engine, rubbed his face with trembling hands, and tried to convince himself he had escaped. But the smell returned. Faint at first, then stronger. The same cloying stench of rot creeping through the car. His heart lurched. He spun around, eyes locking on the back seat. Empty. Just cracked upholstery and shadows. Yet the air was thick, oppressive, as though something unseen sat watching him. And then, softly, a sound, the creak of the door locks. He hadn't touched them. He stared at the dashboard as the locks clicked down one by one, sealing him in. His pulse thundered. He grabbed at the handle, pulling frantically, but it wouldn't budge. From the back seat came a whisper, cold and unmistakable, not finished. The voice was sharp, almost playful, as though mocking him. The smell grew stronger, suffocating now, and in the rearview mirror he caught a glimpse of black fabric, the faint outline of a veil. His scream caught in his throat as the engine roared to life on its own, the headlights blazing against the deserted street. And slowly, without his hands on the wheel, the car began to turn back toward Wat Samian Nari. 2 stories, 2 nightmares, but both bound by the same chilling thread. In Bangkok, the women in black slip silently into the back seat of unsuspecting taxis, vanishing only when their restless spirits have reached the temple where death claimed them. Yet far from the city lights, in the quiet rice fields of rural Thailand, another terror waits at the window, the Krasu. A floating head, glowing eyes piercing the dark, entrails swaying like roots torn from the earth. Where the women in black haunt the roads, the Krasue stalks the villages. Both are warnings, both are reminders. In Thailand, when night falls, the living do not always walk alone. And sometimes it isn't footsteps you should fear, but the sound of wet breathing outside your window. In the countryside of Thailand, the night carries a silence that feels heavier than in the city. The hum of traffic, the neon lights, the constant chatter of Bangkok are gone. Instead, there are fields stretching endlessly beneath the moon, the soft croak of frogs, and the occasional hiss of cicadas echoing through the air. For villagers, this is normal. Life here is slower, simpler. But when darkness falls, stories begin to stir. Stories that make even the most hardened farmers lock their doors, shutter their windows, and pray that no sound lingers outside their home. Our main character is one of those farmers, a man who has lived in the village his whole life, rising before dawn to tend to the rice paddies, returning home at dusk with aching shoulders and calloused hands. He does not scare easily. Years of working the fields have hardened him to snakes, storms, and sleepless nights. But even he cannot shake the stories told around fires and whispered in kitchens. Stories of the Krasu, a woman by day, a monster by night. A floating head with entrails swaying like vines, glowing eyes drifting through the darkness in search of flesh. He tells himself they are only stories. His father told them, his grandfather before him. Old ways of explaining shadows and strange sounds in the fields. Still, on certain nights, when the air feels thick and the dogs bark at nothing, he remembers those warnings. Do not walk alone after dark. Do not leave food scraps outside. Do not open the window if you hear breathing. On this night, the farmer's purpose is simple. His cattle have grown restless, lowing at the far edge of the field. He suspects a stray dog, maybe a thief. With only a lantern in hand, he leaves the safety of his wooden home and makes his way across the paddies. The moon is bright enough to silver the water, but the path feels unfamiliar, every stalk of rice bending unnaturally as though something has brushed past it. The deeper he goes, the more the silence gnaws at him. Even the insects have gone quiet. His lantern flickers in the wind, throwing shadows that sway too far, stretching like fingers against the ground. He tells himself it's nothing, but his chest grows tight. Finally, he reaches the cattle pen. The animals are pressed against the far side of the fence, eyes wide, their breath steaming in the cool night air. Something has frightened them. He raises his lantern higher, scanning the edge of the trees. For a moment, he sees nothing, just branches swaying in the wind. But then he notices it, the glow, faint at first. A soft light hovering just above the tree line, bobbing gently as if carried by invisible hands. He narrows his eyes, his breath catching. It looks almost like a lantern, but too high, too bright. And then it moves, slowly, unnaturally, gliding sideways along the field. The cattle groan louder, stomping their hooves, their panic rising. He feels it then, the shift in the air. Heavy. Wrong. His grandfather's words echo in his head. If you see a light in the field at night, do not follow it. Do not call out. Do not let it come close. The farmer tightens his grip on the lantern. His goal is no longer the cattle, no longer the field. It is to get back home, back to the safety of wooden walls and locked shutters. But with each step backward, the glowing shape draws nearer, drifting out of the tree line and into the open field. And now, he realizes, it is not a lantern at all. The light hovered above the rice field, too steady to be fire, too alive to be explained away. The farmer's first thought was that it might be someone carrying a torch, perhaps a villager walking home late, but his stomach told him otherwise. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of grass, no human shape beneath the glow. Just a pale sphere drifting through the dark, swaying slightly as though carried by a breath of wind. He stepped back slowly, his sandals sinking into the wet soil. The cattle shifted restlessly behind him, their agitation growing louder with every second. He raised his lantern higher, as though its small flame could stand against the unnatural glow approaching the field. For a moment, he considered calling out, to ask if anyone was there, but the words withered in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him not to speak. Then, the light dipped. Lower. Closer. The outline sharpened, and his chest constricted. It wasn't a lantern. It wasn't a torch. It was a face. The glow came from a pair of eyes, pale and luminous, fixed directly on him, and beneath them, swaying gently in the night air, hung strands of entrails, glistening wet in the moonlight. They swung as it moved, slow and deliberate, like vines dangling from a tree. The farmer's grip on the lantern tightened until his knuckles ached. His grandfather's voice rang in his mind again. If you hear breathing outside your window, never open it. If you see her eyes in the dark, do not stare too long. But it was too late. He had already seen. The Krasue floated just above the rice stalks, its hair drifting as though underwater. Its mouth hung slightly open, and though it made no sound, he swore he could hear it, the faint, wet rasp of breath traveling across the empty field. The farmer stumbled back, nearly dropping his lantern. His heel caught on the edge of the pen, and the cattle pressed tighter against the far fence, their panic palpable. He fought the urge to run. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to turn, to sprint back to his home and slam the shutters closed. But fear pinned him in place. And then something shifted. The Krasu stopped moving forward. It hovered, swaying in the air as though sniffing. The entrails beneath it pulsed faintly, a sick glow emanating from its insides. He realized with a sinking horror that it was searching. For him, his lantern flickered again, the flame sputtering in the breeze. He cupped it instinctively, and that tiny movement seemed to catch the creature's attention. Its head tilted unnaturally, jerking too far to the side, the glowing eyes locking on him with sudden, chilling focus. The farmer's breath caught. He knew now he had been seen. The Krasu drifted lower, its entrails brushing the tops of the rice stalks, leaving them slick and bent in its wake. It was moving closer, slowly but deliberately, like a predator circling prey. The sound of breathing grew louder, wet, uneven gasps that filled the silence of the night. The farmer's heart hammered in his chest. He thought of the stories again. They said the Krasu hunted for blood, for waste, for anything living it could consume. They said it peered into windows, searching for the sick, the weak, and the sleeping. He had never believed them. Not really. But now, standing in the field with its glowing eyes fixed on him, belief was no longer a choice. The cattle suddenly burst into cries, their panic breaking the night. One of them kicked against the wooden fence, snapping the post. The crash echoed across the field, and for a moment, the Krasue's gaze flicked toward the noise. That single glance was all he needed. He turned on his heel and bolted, his lantern swinging wildly as he stumbled across the muddy path. His sandals slipped, splashing into the shallow water of the paddy, but he didn't stop. He ran with every ounce of strength left in his legs, the sound of his breath ragged in his ears. Behind him, faint but unmistakable, came another sound, the rasp of breathing, closer now, wet, hungry. The farmer dared not look back. He didn't need to. He already knew the Krasu was following. The farmer's legs pounded against the damp earth as he tore through the narrow path between the rice paddies, lanterns swinging wildly in his grasp. Each step splashed water up his legs, but he didn't care. Behind him, he could still hear it, the ragged, wet breathing that didn't match his own. It came too steady, too close, like something hovering just beyond the reach of his shadow. He risked a glance over his shoulder. For a moment, the night looked empty, only the rice stalks bending gently in the wind. But then, further back along the field, he saw it again. That floating glow, eyes pale and unblinking, fixed on him with unnatural calm. The entrails beneath swayed as the Krasu glided silently above the paddies, never rushing, never stumbling, yet always closing the distance. His chest heaved as he pressed harder, the lantern flickering in his hand. Ahead, he spotted the outline of another figure, an old neighbor, a woman with a scarf tied around her head, crouched low near the edge of the field. At first, relief flooded him. Someone else was awake, someone who could confirm what he was seeing. But when she turned to face him, her expression was not one of surprise, it was of recognition. "You shouldn't have looked," she hissed, her voice sharp and urgent. The farmer skidded to a stop, his heart hammering. "What do you mean?" he gasped. The woman's eyes darted past him toward the glow that now hovered closer to the path. "You saw her face," she said. "Once she knows you've seen her, she won't stop." Her words struck him harder than the pounding in his chest. He had grown up hearing whispers about the Krasu, but no one had ever spoken of rules, conditions. No one had ever mentioned that the simple act of recognition could bind you to her. He opened his mouth to ask more, but the woman suddenly lurched forward, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't go home," she hissed. "Not tonight." Before he could respond, a gust of wind blew through the field, extinguishing his lantern. Darkness swallowed them both. The farmer froze, his breath catching. In the silence, the wet rasp of breathing returned, louder than before. The old woman released his wrist and shoved him toward the path. "Go," she whispered fiercely. "Run, and don't stop until you find light." He stumbled forward, blind in the dark, his hands stretched out in front of him, searching for the familiar edge of the dirt road that would lead back to the village. Behind him, he heard something drag through the rice stalks, slow, deliberate, impossibly close. Then, another sound, not the Krasu, a bell. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it stopped him cold. A single metallic chime, then another, repeating at an uneven rhythm. His mind raced. Bells were sometimes hung outside homes in the village to ward off spirits, the sound believed to confuse wandering ghosts. Could it be coming from the houses, from safety? He turned sharply, chasing the sound, crashing through the rice stalks in desperation. The chime grew louder, guiding him forward. His chest swelled with relief as he finally broke through onto the dirt road, a small shrine standing ahead. A bell swayed gently from the roof, ringing in the wind, but relief turned quickly to dread. The bell wasn't moving on its own. A faint figure stood beneath it, hand pressed against the metal, setting it into motion. He squinted, his breath shallow. It looked like a woman. Long hair, hunched shoulders, face obscured by shadow. The farmer took a hesitant step forward. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure lifted its head slowly, and then he saw it. Not a face, not human at all, the same pale eyes glowing faintly, entrails swaying in the dim light of the shrine. The Krasue had been the one ringing the bell. The farmer staggered back, horror tightening his chest. He had been led here, guided not to safety, but deeper into its grasp. The realization hit him like ice. The stories weren't warnings of what it might do, they were traps it laid for the living. And now, it was closer than ever. The farmer's knees nearly buckled as he stumbled back from the shrine, his lantern long dead and forgotten. The Krasu hung in the air before him, its entrails glistening with a sickly sheen under the faint glow of the shrine's candle. Its eyes, pale and unblinking, locked onto him with an intensity that froze the blood in his veins. He had grown up hearing the legends, the bedtime warnings whispered by mothers to keep children indoors at night, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Krasu wasn't a story, it wasn't a superstition, it was real, and it was watching him. The bell clanged again, once, twice, and the sound reverberated inside his chest, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. The creature tilted its head, jerky and unnatural, as though studying him. Its hair floated weightlessly in the still night air, moving as though caught in invisible water. The farmer stumbled back another step, but the dirt road beneath his feet seemed to narrow, closing in around him. Every direction looked darker than the last. His only light came from the weak flame at the shrine, casting shadows that stretched and warped across the trees. And in those shadows, he swore he saw movement. Hands, not whole ones, but spectral shapes, clutching at the air, reaching for him. He shook his head violently, sweat dripping into his eyes. He didn't want to believe it, but the sight was undeniable. The Krasu wasn't alone. The stories had always spoken of one, a cursed woman who detached her head each night to wander for flesh. But what if there were more? What if the thing that hovered before him was only the one bold enough to show itself? The Krasue moved closer, its entrails trailing against the dirt with a wet slapping sound. The farmer's heart thundered as he backed away, but his heel struck a stone and he toppled, landing hard on his back. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Above him, the creature leaned forward, its pale eyes filling his vision. The wet breathing was deafening now, echoing in his ears. And then, for the first time, it spoke. You saw. The voice was barely human, a wet rasp, bubbling and broken, as if the words came from a throat filled with blood. The farmer's body convulsed with terror. He tried to scramble backward, but the thing drifted with him, relentless. You saw, it repeated, louder this time, its entrails twitching violently, glistening as though alive on their own. He gasped, forcing himself to speak. What do you want? The Krasue froze. Then, slowly, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, teeth long and sharp. Hunger. The word crawled over him like 1,000 insects. He clawed at the dirt, desperate to rise, but the thing surged forward. Its entrails swung, brushing against his leg. The sensation was ice-cold and slimy, a burn that seeped straight through his skin. He cried out, kicking wildly, but the thing hovered closer, mouth opening wider. And then, another voice cut through the night. "Leave him!" The farmer whipped his head toward the sound. The old woman from the field stood at the edge of the road, clutching a bundle of herbs tied with red string. Her eyes blazed with fury as she raised the bundle high. With a sudden motion, she set it alight, the flames bursting bright in the darkness. The Krasu recoiled, hissing, its grin collapsing into a twisted snarl. The entrails thrashed, writhing like snakes in pain. The bell above the shrine rang violently, clanging on its own, louder and faster than before. The farmer scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward the woman, though his legs shook with every step. "What is happening?" he gasped. "What is it?" The old woman didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the Krasu. "A curse," she spat. "A woman who fed on death in life, cursed to feed on the living in death. Once she chooses you, she won't stop." The farmer's stomach twisted. The words hit like a hammer, reframing every second of the night. He hadn't just seen the Krasue, he had been marked by it. The creature shrieked, a sound so high and piercing it rattled his teeth. Its entrails whipped against the dirt, splattering wetness that steamed where it landed. The old woman thrust the burning herbs forward, chanting words he couldn't understand. For a moment, the Krasue flinched, its glow dimming, but then it surged upward, hovering above them both, eyes blazing with fury. The farmer froze, torn between running and collapsing. His entire world had twisted in a single night. What he had thought were bedtime tales were real, and worse, he was now entangled in them. The Krasue swooped lower, entrails reaching as though to wrap around him. The woman shoved him aside, thrusting the flames upward. The fire licked against the creature's face, and it let out another guttural shriek. The sound carried through the fields, a cry that seemed to awaken the night itself. Dogs barked in the distance, birds screeched from the trees. And in the chaos, the farmer realized one horrifying truth. The Krasue was not alone. Beyond the fields he saw them. More faint glows rising in the darkness, drifting between the trees, their pale eyes shining like distant lanterns. At least 3, maybe more. The farmer's heart sank. One Krasue was terror enough. But an entire swarm? The old woman turned sharply to him, her voice cutting through his paralysis. "Run, now." And for the first time, he understood. He wasn't caught in a story. He wasn't witnessing a legend. He was standing in the middle of a nightmare that had been waiting all along, just outside the edge of his window. The farmer's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he stumbled back from the shrine, the old woman's flames casting wild shadows across the road. The Krasue hovered above them, its entrails writhing like living vines, its eyes glowing with venomous hunger. But for the first time that night, he saw it hesitate. The burning herbs, the chanting, the fire. It wasn't driving the creature away, but it unsettled it, forcing it to keep its distance. The farmer turned to the woman, desperate for answers. "What is it? Why me? Why is it following me?" The woman's face was carved with lines of age and exhaustion, her eyes burning with something between anger and pity. "Because you looked," she said flatly. "Because you saw her." The Krasu lives in hunger, but it also lives in shame. She hides in the dark, feeding where no one dares to look. But if you see her, if you know her, she marks you. You are hers until she feeds. Her words dropped like stones in his stomach. The farmer staggered, shaking his head violently. "No, I don't believe this. They're just stories." The woman's laugh was bitter, humorless. That's what they want you to believe. That's why she can keep feeding, generation after generation. By the time you believe, it's too late. The Krasu let out a low hiss, circling above them like a vulture. Its entrails dripped a foul liquid onto the dirt, hissing as it burned into the ground. The farmer felt bile rise in his throat. What do you mean, generation after generation? How long has this been happening? The woman's eyes narrowed. She lowered her bundle of herbs for just a moment, and in the flickering light, her face looked older than he remembered. Tired. Haunted. Longer than you've been alive. Longer than I have. The Krasu isn't just a ghost. It's a curse, passed down from woman to woman, a hunger that never ends. Her words reframed everything he had ever heard. The whispers of neighbors who claimed to see floating lights in the fields. The cattle drained of blood. The infants who sickened overnight. Families blaming fever when no cure ever helped. He thought of his grandfather's warnings, of his father's silence on the subject. They hadn't been just cautionary tales to scare children. They had been instructions for survival. But why tonight? He asked, his voice trembling. Why me? The woman's eyes softened, but only slightly. She was near. You wandered too close, and once she saw you, there was no undoing it. The farmer's stomach twisted, fear warring with anger. He thought of his cattle, his family sleeping in the house at the edge of the village. Were they in danger now, too? Would the Krasu follow him there? Almost as if it could hear his thoughts, the creature swooped lower, its eyes narrowing, its entrails stretching downward like hands reaching for him. The old woman thrust the flames upward again, her chant rising in volume. The Krasue recoiled with a guttural hiss, but the farmer noticed something strange in its reaction. Not just anger, not just hunger. Pain, the herbs, the fire, the chanting. They weren't simply driving it back. They were hurting it. The farmer's eyes widened. It can be stopped. The woman glanced at him sharply. Not stopped, she corrected. Only delayed, only pushed back. Her words cut deeper than he expected. So what? It comes back? Every night? She didn't answer right away, her chant filling the silence instead. Finally she said, until it feeds. The farmer's knees weakened, his breath quickened, until it feeds. The truth crystallized, cold and merciless. The Krasue wasn't just a wandering spirit looking for random prey. It was bound to him now. Because he had seen it. Because it had seen him. He shook his head violently, gripping his hair in trembling fists. No, no, there has to be a way. The old woman's eyes flicked to him, sharp and pitying at once. Perhaps, but those ways are not kind. Her voice trailed, and she turned back to the creature, shouting her chant louder, waving the flames until sparks danced into the night air. The Krasu recoiled again, hissing, its entrails thrashing wildly, and then, suddenly, it shot upward, vanishing into the canopy of trees with unnatural speed. The night fell silent, save for the sound of his ragged breathing. The farmer collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion and shock. For a moment, he let himself believe it was gone, that he had survived. But the woman's voice cut through his fragile hope. Do not go home tonight, she said firmly. If you sleep under your roof, she will find you. She will press her face against your window and breathe until you open it. And once you do, you won't see the morning. The farmer's eyes widened. He thought of his wife, his children. The idea of leaving them unprotected made his chest seize. But my family, the old woman's voice turned sharp, almost a growl. Better she follows you than them. Do you want them to wake with her face at their window? The farmer's stomach dropped. His whole world tilted in that moment. The Krasu wasn't just a story of glowing eyes in the fields. It wasn't just a fleeting nightmare. It was real, it was ancient, and now it was his. And the worst part was knowing the truth. This wasn't the end of the night. It was only the beginning. The farmer sat in the dirt road, his chest heaving, the smell of smoke and herbs clinging to his skin. The old woman had fallen silent, her bundle of burning leaves smouldering low, casting only the faintest glow against the trees. For the first time all night, there was no breathing behind him, no glow in the fields. The Krasue was gone. Or at least, that was what he told himself. "Go to the monastery," the old woman said hoarsely. "Sleep near the monks. The chants will keep her from crossing the walls." Her voice shook with exhaustion, but her eyes held steady. The farmer nodded, though his mind reeled. He thought of his wife asleep in their wooden house, of his children breathing softly behind shuttered windows. The idea of leaving them alone cut into him like a blade. But the woman's words echoed again, "Better she follows you than them." He forced his body upright, legs trembling, and began the long walk toward the village. Every rustle of grass made him flinch. Every flicker of shadow sent his heart pounding. Yet somehow, he reached the edge of the road without seeing the glow return. By the time the monastery came into view, the horizon was already paling with the first hints of dawn. He nearly collapsed at the gates, his body screaming with exhaustion. The monks would find him, he thought. They would understand. They would know how to protect him. But as he turned for one last glance at the path behind him, his blood ran cold. There, just beyond the tree line, hung a faint glow. Not bright, not close, but steady. Waiting. And then he heard it. A wet, rasping breath carried on the wind. He stumbled forward, pounding his fists against the monastery gates, begging for them to open. Yet, even as the heavy doors creaked slowly inward, one truth echoed in his mind, sharper than fear itself. The Krasu hadn't left. It had simply given him a head start. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you liked them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.